Alan Dershowitz leaned back, smirked, and asked Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett if she'd ever read the Constitution. She didn't flinch. She opened his 1982 Law Review article and quoted it against him, verbatim. In that moment, the Harvard legend collapsed on live TV. What happens when arrogance meets preparation and the student schools the master? Keep watching. Before we get to this explosive moment, tell us where you're watching from, and if you believe truth still matters, hit subscribe. We've got another jaw-dropping story coming tomorrow. The CNN studio buzzed with anticipation. Bright lights flooded the stage as Anderson Cooper adjusted his notes. A special segment was about to begin. One billed not just as a political debate, but a constitutional reckoning. On one side of the stage sat Alan Dershowitz, the 85-year-old legal giant, Harvard law professor emeritus, famed for defending presidents and polarizing figures alike. His reputation spanned decades, and so did his ego. With a confident smirk, he leaned into the microphone like a man already convinced of his victory. Across from him sat Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, younger, calm, deliberate. Her background: public defender, civil rights attorney, elected to Congress on a platform of justice, access, and accountability. She didn't radiate flash. She radiated facts. The debate started measured, even respectful. But tension simmered as they clashed over constitutional interpretation, originalism versus evolving jurisprudence. Then came the strike. "All due respect, Congresswoman," Dershowitz said with a dismissive wave. "Constitutional law is not something one learns at a regional school." The studio went silent. Anderson Cooper blinked. Audience members exchanged stunned glances. Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. She calmly reached into her folder, retrieved a yellowed Harvard Law Review article, and slid it across the table. "Then let's put your theory to the test," she said, her voice steady. The camera cut to Dershowitz's face, brows furrowed, confidence slipping. He stared down at the paper. His name was on it. So was a handwritten margin note, in Crockett's unmistakable script, undercutting his own argument with precedent he himself had published. The moment was frozen in time. Voiceover. What happened next wasn't just a debate. It was a reckoning, one that shattered arrogance and reminded America who the law really belongs to. Alan Dershowitz didn't just practice law. He curated a legal persona that towered over courtrooms, campuses, and cable news studios for half a century. Harvard Law School professor emeritus, prolific author, ubiquitous commentator, defender of the famous and the infamous alike. O.J. Simpson, Jeffrey Epstein, Donald Trump. To admirers, he was the relentless guardian of civil liberties. To critics, the consummate technician who could massage principle to fit power. Either way, his resume cemented him as the archetype of the Ivy League legal establishment. White, male, institutionally armored, certain that pedigree equals superiority. For decades, that armor held. Students quoted him. Judges cited him. Producers booked him. But the shine dulled. His association with Epstein permanently stained his public standing. His shifting defenses of executive power during the Trump years alienated colleagues who once treated his scholarship as gospel. The habit that long fueled his relevance, stepping into every controversy as the loudest constitutional voice. Still, Dershowitz clung to a creed. Academic prestige is proof of expertise. In his world, Harvard wasn't just a noun. It was a credentialed battleman. That belief wasn't incidental. It shaped how he debated, how he dismissed, how he ranked other voices. He cast himself as gatekeeper of real constitutional discourse, the arbiter of who counted and who didn't. So when a congresswoman from a regional school challenged him on national television, he instinctively reached for the move that had always worked: question the credentials, not the case law. What he didn't grasp, what many of his generation still struggle to see, is that the center of gravity in American law has been shifting. The most urgent constitutional fights aren't playing out in Harvard seminars. They're unfolding in courtrooms where defendants can't afford elite counsel, in legislative hearings where lived consequences matter more than Latin maxims, and on national broadcasts where clarity beats condescension. Dershowitz walked into the CNN studio expecting deference to a dynasty. He met a practitioner who came armed with receipts, precedent, and his own words. And for the first time in a very long time, the old guard's armor cracked, live, in high definition. Jasmine Crockett didn't arrive in Congress via the gilded pipeline of clerkships, think tanks, and Ivy League pedigree. She was forged in real courtrooms, where missed rent, police violence, and rigged systems weren't hypotheticals but human beings sitting 2 feet away, hoping the law could still mean something. Born in St. Louis, educated at the University of Houston Law Center, she built her legal reputation in Dallas, representing the marginalized, suing institutions that hid behind procedure, and treating the Constitution not as an artifact to be admired, but as a weapon to be wielded on behalf of people the system preferred to forget. Her style was never about theatrics. It was about precision, cross-examiner's cadence, prosecutor's focus, every question a scalpel, every citation a trap. In Congress, that same courtroom discipline made her a quiet terror in hearings while others performed for sound bites. She stacked facts, statutes, and precedent until witnesses ran out of talking points. Colleagues learned quickly, underestimate her at your own risk. So when CNN called to pair her with Alan Dershowitz on presidential power and executive privilege, Crockett understood exactly what the booking producers were really staging: a clash between the old model of legal authority and the new reality of lived constitutionalism. For her, it wasn't about scoring a clip. It was about representing every brilliant lawyer told their school wasn't top tier. Every woman of color patronized by a man who mistook elitism for rigor. Every community lawyer who learned the Constitution by fighting the government, not flattering it. She prepared like trial day. She reread Nixon v. Fitzgerald, Clinton v. Jones, Youngstown v. Sawyer. She annotated Justice Jackson's concurrence like a roadmap for exposing hypocrisy. And she pulled something extra. A 1982 Law Review article authored by Dershowitz himself, a piece that undercut the very argument he'd been peddling on television for months. If he tried the credential play, she would not only refuse to fold, she would flip his own scholarship against him. The debate was personal, yes, but not petty. Crockett wasn't there to humiliate a man for sport. She was there to demonstrate in front of millions that the law belongs to those who master it, not just those who inherit its podiums. She came to prove that experience is a qualification, that rigor isn't monopolized by marble halls, and that the next generation of legal leadership isn't asking for permission to be taken seriously. They're taking the mic and bringing the casebook. The CNN studio gleamed under high-definition lights, every camera trained on the legal heavyweight panel assembled for the night's most anticipated segment, a deep dive into the scope and limits of executive privilege. Seated opposite each other, Alan Dershowitz and Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett didn't just represent clashing opinions. They embodied 2 clashing worlds. One was an Ivy League legend with 5 decades of courtroom swagger. The other was a rising congressional firebrand whose legal acumen was earned not in the halls of Harvard, but in the trenches of real-world justice. Anderson Cooper welcomed viewers, introducing the segment with the gravity it deserved. Tonight, a former presidential advisor faces contempt charges, but at the heart of the debate is one constitutional question: how far does executive privilege go? Dershowitz, his voice smooth and rehearsed, launched first. The concept of executive privilege exists precisely to protect open deliberation between a president and his advisors. To criminalize that is to criminalize governance itself. Crockett, seated with a pen in one hand and case notes in the other, waited. When it was her turn, she leaned forward, voice firm but calm. "Respectfully, Professor," she said, "privilege isn't an invisibility cloak. It's not limitless. That's not just my opinion. That's the opinion of the Supreme Court in United States v. Nixon." Dershowitz arched an eyebrow. But you must understand the nuance of constitutional interpretation, Congresswoman. There's the academic understanding, and then there's the soundbite version." He grinned. The studio laughed nervously. But Crockett didn't flinch. She continued, citing a list of decisions: Nixon, Cheney v. United States, and more. "These aren't soundbites. They're precedent. They weren't decided at Harvard. They were decided in the courtroom. Dershowitz's smile thinned. Do you even understand the cases you're citing? Where did you go to law school? The room went still. Cooper's hand dropped from his note cards. The audience held its breath. And Crockett, composed as ever, just nodded. University of Houston Law Center. Dershowitz chuckled. That explains a lot. It wasn't just a dig. It was an assault on every underdog lawyer in America, on every jurist who'd earned their stripes in local courts, and not Ivy Towers. The studio's temperature dropped. The fight had just become personal, and it was far from over. The moment Alan Dershowitz smirked and said, "That explains a lot," the studio fell into a kind of suspended disbelief. The dig wasn't just about Jasmine Crockett's law school. It was a dismissal of her legitimacy, her training, her place at that table. You could feel it in the audience. A quiet tension thickened the air. Anderson Cooper blinked slowly, then turned his head toward Crockett, as if silently bracing for impact. But she didn't explode. She didn't raise her voice. Instead, she leaned back slightly in her chair, calmly uncapping her pen, and said with total composure, "So let's test that Harvard rigor, shall we?" Dershowitz hesitated, the grin still stretched across his face. But it was beginning to look more forced than confident. Crockett reached for her binder. "You mentioned the understanding of executive privilege. Let's start there. You've argued that the president's communications must be absolutely protected to preserve national security. But in your own 1982 Law Review article, you stated, quote, no privilege, executive or otherwise, can stand when it interferes with a legitimate investigation of potential criminal conduct." The audience murmured. Cooper leaned forward slightly. "You wrote that, didn't you?" she asked. Dershowitz opened his mouth, but no sound came. Finally, he managed a cautious, "Context matters, Congresswoman." "Then let's provide it," Crockett replied. "Because if we're talking about precedent, not prestige, the context is this: Nixon v. Fitzgerald, Clinton v. Jones, Cheney v. U.S. District Court. Each of those decisions limited executive privilege when the public interest outweighed secrecy." Dershowitz shifted in his seat. He looked suddenly much older, much less invincible. "Now," Crockett said, "I may not have studied in Cambridge, but I've litigated constitutional violations in real courtrooms. I've sat with victims of state violence. I've argued qualified immunity before judges who didn't know my name. And I've never lost sight of one truth. No law degree entitles someone to lie about what the Constitution actually says." The audience was silent. "This isn't about Harvard or Houston," she continued. "It's about whether facts still matter in a democracy." And just like that, the conversation had shifted. It wasn't about academic pedigree anymore. It was about truth. And Crockett had just reclaimed the ground Dershowitz thought he owned. Jasmine Crockett didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. Her calm precision now sliced through the debate like a scalpel. Holding up a neatly annotated printout, she began with, "Let's talk about Nixon v. Fitzgerald, 1982. The court held that a president is entitled to absolute immunity from civil damages for official acts, but not criminal investigation. You agree?" Dershowitz nodded slowly, reluctant. "Now, Clinton v. Jones, 1997, she continued. The Supreme Court ruled a sitting president is not immune from civil litigation for unofficial acts committed before taking office. You were vocal about that case. You called it a victory for accountability." He shifted uncomfortably. Again, context. Crockett wasn't done. Youngstown Sheet and Tube, Coe v. Sawyer, 1952. Justice Jackson's concurrence, widely cited, including by you, outlined 3 tiers of presidential power. When a president acts against the express or implied will of Congress, his power is at its lowest ebb. She paused and looked directly at Dershowitz. "You've cited that framework in 5 different articles. I've read them all. So when you defended Trump's executive privilege claim regarding classified documents, after Congress had explicitly demanded them, you were contradicting not just precedent, but your own scholarship. There was no answer. Dershowitz's jaw was tight. The audience leaned in. Then Crockett dropped the final blow. In your 1982 Harvard Law Review article, you wrote, and I quote, "When the executive branch seeks immunity from judicial scrutiny, it invites despotism under the guise of discretion." Those are your words, Professor. The audience gasped. Cooper's eyes widened. She leaned in slightly, pen still in hand. "So, were you wrong then? Or are you wrong now?" Dershowitz blinked, mouth partially open. He looked dazed. Not angry. Not indignant. Just caught. It was the rarest sight in American legal commentary. A man long thought untouchable being held to account on his own record by someone the old guard had deemed unworthy of sharing his stage. Crockett closed her binder. This debate was supposed to be about executive privilege, but what we just witnessed was something more dangerous. Privilege, period. The kind that thinks prestige excuses contradiction. The kind that fears being fact-checked by someone who didn't walk the same marble halls. The crowd erupted, not with cheers, but with something more potent, stunned, respectful silence. The kind of silence that follows truth laid bare. Dershowitz, the gatekeeper of constitutional discourse, had just been dismantled by the very woman he tried to discredit. Alan Dershowitz had spent his entire life wielding legal pedigree like a weapon. From the Harvard Law Review to the O.J. Simpson trial, his resume wasn't just decorated, it was mythologized. But in this moment, seated under the harsh lights of the CNN stage, he looked less like the legendary gatekeeper of constitutional law and more like a man caught in a paradigm shift he never anticipated. And Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett wasn't letting him escape. She leaned forward slightly, her voice calm but loaded with conviction. "So let me get this straight, Professor Dershowitz," she began. "You've defended millionaires, billionaires, and sexual predators. You've stood in front of juries and TV cameras and told America that even the most powerful deserve the benefit of the law. But when a black woman, a former civil rights attorney, elected by the people and tested in real courtrooms, speak about the Constitution, you act like I should ask your permission to speak." Dershowitz's eyes narrowed. "That's not what I said." "That's exactly what you implied," Crockett interrupted. "And more importantly, it's exactly what you represent. You don't question my arguments, you question my right to make them." The audience, once respectfully silent, now stirred, audibly. Crockett didn't raise her voice, but the indictment in her tone cut deeper than any gavel. "You want to talk about rigorous training? Fine, let's talk about my regional law school. At the University of Houston, I studied constitutional law under professors who'd actually argued before the Supreme Court. I represented women brutalized by the state, children facing prison for poverty, and entire families devastated by bad policing. You lectured about justice from an ivory tower. I fought for it in the trenches." Dershowitz tried again to regain footing. "Congresswoman, courtroom experience doesn't replace constitutional theory." "No," she snapped back, "but it proves whether your theory holds up when real lives are on the line." It was more than a rebuttal. It was a reckoning. In under 2 minutes, she had reframed the entire debate, not as a clash over legal nuance, but as a referendum on elitism itself. She wasn't just defending herself. She was defending every public defender who got dismissed in law school debates, every grassroots lawyer told they were too emotional, every woman of color who had to be twice as prepared just to be taken half as seriously. "You've spent your career defending the elite," she continued. "I've spent mine defending the invisible, so forgive me if I don't find your sneer convincing." The silence in the studio was thunderous. Dershowitz's fingers tapped restlessly against the desk. For once, he didn't have a clever retort, a lofty quote, or a smug dismissal. He had brought a sword, made of credentials, to a fight over credibility, and Crockett had shattered it with lived truth. Anderson Cooper glanced to his producers off camera. They were riveted. so was America. This wasn't just a moment, it was a mirror, and Crockett had turned it on the establishment. Alan Dershowitz shifted in his seat, visibly uncomfortable. The carefully cultivated air of superiority that had carried him through decades of high-profile cases was beginning to dissolve under the relentless precision of Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. This wasn't just a clash of credentials. It was a dismantling of legacy, brick by brick, syllable by syllable. Dershowitz tried to deflect. "I've defended the Constitution for over 50 years. I don't need a lecture from someone who—" Crockett didn't let him finish. "From someone who what, Professor? Didn't clerk for a Supreme Court justice? Didn't teach in Cambridge? Didn't defend Jeffrey Epstein?" The studio fell dead silent. Anderson Cooper inhaled sharply. Crockett continued, steady as ever. "Let's talk about defense. You defended power. I defended people crushed by it. You used legal loopholes to protect the wealthy. I used the Constitution to shield the voiceless. You say you respect the law, but when it's used by someone like me, someone who didn't grow up with your privilege, suddenly it's not rigorous enough." Dershowitz raised a trembling hand in protest, but the damage was already spreading. The camera caught the twitch of his lips, the way he licked them nervously. How his gaze bounced from Cooper to the audience, to the teleprompter, searching for an exit. There was none. "Let me tell you about one of my clients," Crockett said, voice softer now, but deadlier for it. "Her name was Latasha. She was jailed for defending herself from an abusive partner. The DA tried to throw the book at her. No Ivy League lawyer showed up to help, but I did. I didn't write an op-ed. I wrote a motion, and I won." Cooper tried to regain control. "Congresswoman, let's stay on topic." "This is the topic," Crockett replied sharply. "This is what happens when legal theory is tested by reality. When the law isn't just debated, it's lived." Dershowitz leaned in, attempting a final retort. "What you're doing now is emotional theater. The law—" She cut him off again. "The law is only worth something if it works for everyone, not just the men you've dined with in Martha's Vineyard." The blow landed. Even the conservative panelists seated off stage blinked in astonishment. This wasn't a debate anymore. It was a deposition, and Dershowitz was unraveling under cross-examination from someone he had believed beneath him. But Crockett wasn't beneath anyone. She had risen above systems meant to shut her out, and now she stood atop the moment. "What scares you," she said, "is not that I'm wrong, but that I'm right, and you can't stop me with credentials." It was the line that broke him. He sat back, visibly shaken. No scoff, no snark, no spin, just a fading giant blinking beneath the glare of a world that no longer bowed to him. Anderson Cooper, sensing the shift, let the silence breathe. For decades, Dershowitz had been the loudest voice in the room. Tonight, he had no voice at all. Jasmine Crockett didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She opened a manila folder on the desk in front of her and pulled out a printout, highlighted, annotated, and time-stamped. "Professor Dershowitz," she began, "in 1982 you published a piece in the Harvard Law Review titled Presidential Accountability and the Limits of Executive Immunity." She looked up, eyes steady. "Ring a bell?" Dershowitz shifted, uncertain. "I've written hundreds of articles." "I know. I've read this one cover to cover," Crockett replied. "Allow me to quote you. Your words, not mine. No president is above the law, and executive privilege must never be used to shield criminal behavior or suppress public accountability." The room was so still that even the blinking red light of the studio camera felt loud. She turned to the camera. "That's not from my notes. That's from page 17, second column near the bottom." Dershowitz opened his mouth, then closed it. Crockett pressed on. "Now, contrast that with your position tonight. You argued that President Trump's privilege should protect him from congressional scrutiny. You've claimed, on this very stage, that executive immunity must be broad and unassailable." She placed both quotes side by side on the monitor. The contradiction was glaring. "Either you were wrong then," she said, "or you're wrong now." Dershowitz's face reddened. "Context matters, Congresswoman. The country was different in 1982. Crockett leaned forward. "The Constitution hasn't changed, Professor. Just your audience." That line pierced deeper than any law school cross-examination. Anderson Cooper turned his head toward Dershowitz, waiting for a response. The Harvard professor, the man who once shaped national debates from the op-ed pages of the New York Times, sat frozen, not because he lacked words, but because none would suffice. "You argue now that privilege should shield leaders from legal consequence," Crockett continued. "But when it was Nixon, you wanted accountability. When it was Clinton, you wanted transparency, and when it's Trump, suddenly the law is too harsh." She held up one more sheet. "And let's not forget this gem. Any scholar who shifts doctrine based on political affiliation loses the right to be called a constitutionalist, also from your article." There it was, the final blow. His own words turned into a scalpel. Dershowitz opened his mouth, but no sound came out. Crockett sat back, expression unreadable. Not smug, not gloating, just finished. The audience didn't clap. They didn't need to. The silence said everything. It was the sound of the old guard collapsing beneath the weight of its own hypocrisy. Anderson Cooper finally spoke. "We'll be right back." The screen faded to commercial on the last frame of Dershowitz's stunned face. And somewhere, in law schools across the country, professors began updating their syllabi. Because tonight, constitutional law had a new voice. And it didn't come from Harvard. Within minutes of the CNN segment ending, the internet detonated. Crocker destroys Dershowitz rocketed to the top of Twitter/X alongside Your Own Words Professor and Harvard v. Houston. The 15-second clip of Jasmine Crockett reading Alan Dershowitz's 1982 law review passage, then slicing with, "Your own words, Professor? I just read them better," was reposted so many times CNN's social team couldn't keep up. In under an hour, that clip alone cleared 3 million views. By sunrise, it was embedded in newsletters, Substacks, and law school listservs. Legal Twitter became a real-time fact-checking chorus. Constitutional scholars from Columbia, Michigan, UCLA, and, yes, even Harvard, confirmed every citation Crockett fired off. Nixon v. Fitzgerald, Clinton v. Jones, Youngstown Sheet and Tube v. Sawyer, and Justice Jackson's 3-part framework. A Georgetown professor wrote, "This wasn't a debate. It was a demonstration. I'm assigning it to my con law class tomorrow." Another thread from a Yale lecturer ended bluntly, "Elitism is not an argument." YouTube lit up next. Legal Eagle titled his emergency stream, "Dershowitz just got out litigated on live TV." Popular TikTok attorneys stitched Crockett's lines into rapid-fire explainers. Here's why Justice Jackson's 3 categories matter. Why executive privilege isn't a magic shield. How to destroy credentialism in 30 seconds. One creator framed it perfectly. This is why courtroom lawyers eat TV theorists for breakfast. But it wasn't only lawyers. Nurses, teachers, factory workers, and veterans piled into the comments. "I didn't go to an Ivy either, but I know hypocrisy when I see it." This woman just spoke for every kid who was told their school wasn't good enough. Campaign donations to Crockett spiked. Small dollar, recurring, tagged with notes like, "For every student who got talked down to," and "Run for Senate." Memes flooded timelines. Anderson Cooper leaning back, eyes wide, captioned, "When the syllabus just turned on the professor." A split screen of Crockett's calm face and Dershowitz's stunned expression, labeled, "Practice versus Pedigree." A still of her holding the article. Receipts greater than reputation. Reddit's r/politics pinned a mega-thread of legal breakdowns. Law students posted screenshots of syllabi updated overnight. Tomorrow, Crockett versus Dershowitz, bring blue books. Even some conservative commentators admitted the obvious. You can disagree with her politics and still acknowledge she won on the law. By midnight, one consensus had formed across platforms that almost never agree. Jasmine Crockett didn't just win an argument, She broke a hierarchy. The fallout wasn't just digital, it was institutional. Within 24 hours of the debate, the University of Houston Law Center's website traffic quadrupled. Prospective students flooded the admissions portal. Alumni began tagging the school in viral threads. That's where Jasmine Crockett trained. That's where real lawyers are made. The dean issued a rare public statement. Excellence is earned in the courtroom, not inherited by lineage. Other regional law schools felt a ripple effect. Applications surged at HBCU law programs, with prospective students citing Crockett by name. At Southern University Law Center and Texas Southern's Thurgood Marshall School of Law, professors held impromptu sessions titled Breaking the Ivy Myth. One student tweeted, "I used to be ashamed of not getting into a T14. After tonight, I'm proud to be here." The sentiment went viral. Meanwhile, Harvard Law found itself under scrutiny. Several faculty members distanced themselves from Dershowitz, issuing lukewarm statements about respecting diverse paths to legal practice. The official account stayed silent. A Harvard Law alum editorialized in the Boston Globe, "Tonight, we learned that scholarship without humility is a liability, not a legacy." Civil rights groups, women's advocacy organizations, and progressive PACs called Crockett's performance historic, generational, and a turning point for legal credibility. The ACLU reposted the debate clip with the caption, "This is what fearless advocacy looks like." Emily's List sent out a fundraising blast. "If you believe truth and training matter more than titles, support Jasmine Crockett." Even law schools themselves began changing. Georgetown Law, Rutgers, and the University of Michigan announced pilot programs titled Practical Power, Real-World Constitutional Argument. Designed around debates like the one viewers just witnessed, they aim to recenter the law around its impact, not its pedigree. "We are inspired by Rep. Crockett's clarity, preparation, and fearlessness," read the program brief from Rutgers. But the most lasting shift may have come, not from an institution, but from a belief. One that echoed across lecture halls, break rooms, and social media comment sections. Your law school doesn't define you. Your work does. And that idea, spoken so boldly in one debate, just changed the standard for legal credibility in America. The camera stays on Jasmine Crockett. No graphics, no applause, just resolve. This was never about humiliating a man with a famous diploma. It was about proving that law belongs to the prepared, not the privileged. It was about every lawyer told to sit down because their school wasn't on a sweatshirt. She breathes, then continues. "Listen to me. Brilliance is not conferred, it is demonstrated. In motions filed at midnight. In clients defended when nobody is watching. In questions that make power sweat. If you have receipts, you have a right to speak. If you have the Constitution on your side, you have a duty to fight." Her voice firms. "I learned law in crowded courtrooms, not ivory towers. I learned justice by standing next to people the system had already decided were disposable. And I learned that the loudest credential in any room is courage backed by preparation." She leans toward the lens. So to every public defender, every night student, every kid who was told, "People like you don't make it," prove them wrong. Study harder, argue cleaner, ask the question they're terrified you'll ask. Force the record to remember you. A final beat. This wasn't about one debate. It was a line in the sand. We will not let elitism masquerade as excellence. We will not mistake reputation for integrity. And we will not let arrogance decide who gets to define the law in this country. She closes with certainty. We exposed the contradiction. We challenged the gatekeepers. We reminded the world that expertise is earned in courtrooms, not granted by diplomas. If that resonates with you, stand with us. Then the call to action. Subscribe. Share. Stay informed. Because the next courtroom revolution is already forming, and when it breaks, you'll want to be in the room, prepared, principled, and unafraid. To voters, demand evidence, not slogans. To law students, read the footnotes and the transcripts. To professors, teach humility alongside doctrine. To judges, remember the people behind the precedents. To the media, stop mistaking pedigree for proof. And to anyone who has ever been talked over, minimized, or credential-checked into silence, this is your permission slip to speak louder, with facts sharper than any sneer. History doesn't move because the powerful allow it. It moves because the prepared refuse to yield. That's our promise to you, and it's our challenge to them. Stay loud, stay lawful, stay meticulous. The future of justice won't be Latin. It will be written by people who did the work and dared to count aloud.